Hi there, it's Monday. It's the first day of it's the first day of week 13 of 52 weeks of vlogging, and it's week 13, and I hope that the rest of week 13 is better than this day has been, because this day started out well, but it ended up sucking. And I want to talk to you about Boston, and I want to talk to you about terrorism, and I want to talk to you about dancing kidlets in my brain, because that actually has a lot to do with what happened today, I think. Partly to do with what happened today. And I'll start with a story about a young couple with a beautiful child who had not a bad life by any stretch. They weren't in an impoverished country, and they weren't impoverished themselves, and they had food, and they had somewhere to sleep, and they had somewhere to stay and somewhere to live, and they weren't miserable, but the man had to work really long hours, and they kind of felt like their situation was stuck. They didn't see anything improving anytime soon. They were never going to have a yard, and they lived in a city that was really polluted with really dirty air, and they decided to leave. And then shortly before they moved to a different city in a different country with cleaner air and cheaper food and cheaper housing and better pay scales, the London bombings happened in the summer of 2005. And suddenly, the biggest reason for the wife was to get away from terrorism. And that wife was me. And since then, we have had the Aurora shootings and the Virginia shootings and the Oregon shootings, and even shootings at the mall in Eaton Center in Toronto in Canada, and the Newtown shootings, and now Boston bombings. And whether you are shooting people or bombing people, you're terrorizing people. It's an act of terrorism. And when you go to a public place and you hurt people, you're terrorizing them. And it's not okay. And we all know this. And while I still stand by the other reasons that we had for leaving London and moving to Canada, reasons to do with wanting a better standard of living, with not wanting to have to work such long hours in order to earn enough to pay for things like food and rent and stuff like that, for wanting cleaner air and a yard for the kids to run around in. I stand by all those reasons, but I don't stand by the running away from terrorism thing, because I don't think you can do that anymore. I used to think you could just go to a safer place. You know, Canada's a big country, it's a peaceful country, they pretty much stay out of other countries' business unless they get roped into it by one of their neighbors, America. And yeah, and you know, I used to think, yes, we'll go to Canada and nobody will bother us there because Canada. And I don't think that anymore. Not that I'm expecting someone to, you know, bomb the shit out of Toronto tomorrow or anything like that. But, and I hope that that never happens. But I don't think running away from the bad people is the answer, because the bad people are everywhere. The bad people are definitely not all the people. And humanity on the whole is really good, and humanity on the whole is amazing. And I, things like seeing the marathon runners coming close to the finish line and realizing that something horrible had happened and just running to the hospital to donate blood restore faith in humanity. And at the same time, there is going to be someone everywhere. There's always going to be someone. And you can't run away from those people. What you can do is foster an environment in which those people can be identified and helped so that they don't do things like this, that they can be stopped before they reach this point of destruction and terrorism, and raise our children to not be those people, raise our children to be the loving people, the people who, when they hear about something horrible happening, donate their clothing or their blood or food or whatever they can to help people. We can foster that in ourselves, and we can foster that in our children. And I think that, okay, you're going to get mad at me because you're going to think that I'm blaming video games and violent movies. And I'm not saying video games and violent movies will turn your child into a mass murdering terrorist. I am not saying that, because they won't. But what I am saying is that I think we need to think harder about what we put onto our tape and what we put onto our children's tape. And those babies whose mommies are taking them to the movies to see Mr. and Mrs. Smith on Mom and Tots Day, just because they're not going to turn 7 and say, hey, remember that Mr. and Mrs. Smith movie you took me to when I was 4 months old? Just because they're not going to do that doesn't mean that that movie is not informing their worldview. And it doesn't mean that what they're seeing is not changing their growing perception of what's normal in the world and what's acceptable in the world and what the world is and what the world should be. That book that I talked about yesterday, Escape from Camp 14, that's about a young man who was raised believing that no one should try to escape because they belonged there, and that anybody who tried to escape should be reported, and that people who were reported for trying to escape would be executed, and that this was the way things should be. He was raised to believe that, and so he believed it. And so he turned in his mother and his brother for planning to escape. And he watched them be executed. And he thought, yes, this is a good thing. I've done a good thing. We raise our children into the world that we offer them. And I don't think it's necessarily a good idea to offer them a world of violent video games and violent movies when they're so young. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. And it doesn't mean nobody should play violent video games. It doesn't mean nobody should watch violent movies. But I think, all things in moderation, and this is the dancing kidlets thing. There's a book you should read. It's called The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains by Nicholas Carr. And it's about how when we do something repeatedly and repetitively over and over and over, we do alter our neural pathways, and we do train our brain and prepare our brain to think in a certain way and to do certain things. And what do you want to train your brain to do? Do you want to train your brain to shoot up characters on a screen or shoot up real people? Or do you want to train your brain to, I don't know, do something else? Plant things, or play a song, or create music, or create art, or create stories. Violent video games in and of themselves are not bad or wrong, and neither are violent movies. And our culture's problems are not happening because of violent video games or violent movies. But I do think that our culture is sickly. And I think that part of our problem is detachment and lack of engagement. And I watched kids dance on a stage for 6 hours, and then after that, every time I blinked, I saw kids dancing on a stage in my head. I play Diamond Dash on my phone for 20 minutes, and then after a week of doing that every day, every time I blink, I see the Diamond Dash screen in my mind. And I don't think what they're saying in this book is wrong. I think what they're saying in this book is very, very right. And I think that we need to understand that when we teach ourselves to think a certain way and we prepare our minds to do certain things, no, it's not going to turn you necessarily into someone who would do something as horrible and horrific as what happened today. But as a culture, it becomes something that becomes more possible. It becomes something that becomes a more likely part of our world. It becomes something that for that one person who needs extra help, who doesn't have the same levels of empathy, who is not engaged with the world. Because when we're engaged with the world and when we're engaged with our communities, we don't want to do these things. because then we're hurting ourselves as much as we're hurting somebody else, because that community is part of us and those people are part of us. They're part of who we are. And when we detach from all of that, then I think it becomes more possible. And I don't want our culture to be a culture of detachment. I want our culture to be a culture of engagement and of warmth and of support and giving. And I think that that's still possible. I don't want us to continue towards yeah, I don't want to give my children a world where everybody's detached and everybody just goes into their room and does stuff on computers all day. I do stuff on computers a lot, but I do other stuff too. And I think everybody should. Everybody should, yes, do stuff on computers, but do stuff with people too, because engagement is important. Engagement is one of the things that reminds us to love each other and support each other. And it's one of the ways that we have to fight against this kind of thing happening again. There's a sentence I started to say before and I didn't finish it and I can't remember what it was, but I think you understand what I'm saying. Video games are not bad, but a society that forgets to engage, a society of people who forget to engage with each other is bad. And let's not do that. Read this book, hug somebody, tell them you love them, and thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.